On the morning of the 21st of October 1966, in a mining village in South Wales, a man-made mountain of waste began to move. It came down the hillside and it engulfed the village school, and it killed 116 children. This is what happened. Aberfan was a village in the coal mining valleys of South Wales. Above it, on the hillside, the local colliery had for years been depositing its waste. The spoil, the rock and shale and unwanted material brought up out of the mine along with the coal. The waste was tipped into great mounds, the spoil tips high on the slope. Above the houses, on a wet October morning, one of those tips, saturated with water, gave way. It slid down the hillside as a moving mass of waste, and at the foot of the slope it reached and overwhelmed the village primary school full that morning of children. This is Post-Mortem. We don't sensationalize. We reconstruct. Tonight, one of the most heartbreaking industrial disasters of the 20th century, and the chain of negligence, ignored warnings, an institutional failure that allowed a mountain of waste to be built above a village school and then to come down on it. We are going to walk it the way an investigator walks it. The tips, the springs beneath them, the years of warnings, the wet morning, the slide, and the inquiry that found, in plain words, that this disaster should never have happened. To understand the Aberfan disaster, you have to understand the spoil tip, because the spoil tip is the entire story, and it is a feature of industrial life that needs explaining. When a coal mine operates, it does not bring up only coal. It brings up, along with the coal, a great quantity of other material, rock shale, the unwanted spoil that has to be separated out and disposed of. Over the years of a colliery's operation, that waste accumulates in enormous quantities. It has to go somewhere. In the South Wales valleys, with their steep hillsides and their narrow valley floors, crowded with the colliery and the village, the somewhere was the hillside. The colliery waste was tipped onto the slopes above the workings, carried up and deposited year after year, building the spoil into great man-made mounds. The tips. At Aberfan, this had been going on for a long time. There were several tips on the hillside above the village. They were large, they were tall, and one of them, the tip that would fail, had been built up on the slope directly above the village, above the houses, and above the school. A mountain of industrial waste, accumulating year after year on a steep hillside directly above a village full of people. That was the situation at Aberfan, and it had been the situation growing slowly worse for years before the disaster. Now, I have to describe how those tips were built and managed, because the gap between how they were managed and how they should have been managed is the heart of this disaster. A large spoil tip is, whether anyone chose to think of it that way or not, an engineering structure. It is a huge mass of material built up on a slope, held in place by nothing but its own internal strength and the friction of the ground beneath it. Its stability is an engineering question. Whether it will stay where it is put or whether it will slide depends on the material, the slope, the height, the water within it, and the ground it sits on. A structure like that, looming over a village, demands real engineering oversight. It demands that someone qualified should assess its stability, should consider the ground beneath it, should monitor it, should ensure it is built and maintained so that it cannot fail. At Aberfan, that engineering oversight did not exist. The tips were built and managed, in effect, as mere dumping, as the routine unexamined disposal of waste, and not as the construction and maintenance of large, potentially dangerous structures above a populated valley. There was no proper system for assessing tip stability. There was no qualified engineering attention being paid to whether the mountain of waste above the village was safe. The tip that would kill 116 children was not an engineered structure that failed. It was an unengineered mound of waste that had never been treated as the hazard it was. There was a specific, terrible fact about the ground on which the failing tip had been built, and it is central to the disaster. The hillside above Aberfan had water in it. There were springs on that slope, natural sources of water emerging from the ground. The presence of water on that hillside was not a secret. It was a known feature of the local geography. And the tip that failed had been built over that ground, built up on a part of the slope where water emerged. So the great mound of waste was sitting on top of springs. Water from within the hillside was emerging beneath and within the tip. Now I have to explain why that combination waste tipped over springs is so dangerous, because it is the engineering and scientific core of the episode. The stability of a tip, whether it stays put or slides, depends enormously on water. Water within the mass of waste changes everything about how that material behaves. Here is what water does to a tip. A mound of dry, loose mining waste has a certain strength. The fragments of rock and shale rest against one another, held by friction, and that friction gives the mass its ability to stand on a slope. When water saturates that mass, when water fills the spaces between the fragments, the behavior of the material changes profoundly. The water can reduce the friction that holds the fragments together. A saturated mass of waste is weaker, less stable, more prone to slide than a dry one. And there is a more dangerous possibility still. Under certain conditions, a saturated mass of loose, fine, waterlogged material can lose its strength almost entirely and begin to behave not like a solid at all, but like a fluid. The mass can flow. A saturated tip, in the worst case, does not simply slump a little. It can liquefy and move down a slope as a fast-flowing slurry, a flowing mass of waste and water with the speed and the destructive force of a flood. That is what the springs beneath the Aberfan tip created the potential for. A great mound of waste sitting on sources of water being saturated from below and being turned slowly into a structure that could, given enough water, stop being a mound and become a moving flow. And in October of 1966, the tip received more water still from above. The period before the disaster was wet. There had been substantial rain. So the tip above Aberfan, already built over springs and saturated from below, was also being soaked from above by rainfall. The water content of the tip was rising. The mass of waste was becoming more and more saturated, weaker and weaker, closer and closer to the condition in which it could flow. This is the same shape this channel has found in disaster after disaster. A slope, a condition steadily worsening, a system being pushed toward a threshold. In the Bhopal episode and the Texas City episode, the threshold was a chemical runaway. Here it is, a mechanical geotechnical threshold. The point at which a saturated mass of waste loses its strength and begins to move. The tip above Aberfan, through the wet autumn of 1966, was climbing toward that threshold. And as in every episode of this channel, the most painful part of the story is that this was not invisible. It had been seen. It had been warned of the danger of those tips, had been raised clearly before a single child died. The Aberfan disaster was not a bolt from a clear sky. It was, the inquiry would find, a disaster that had been foreseen, and foreseen specifically, and warned of, and the warnings had not been acted upon. This is the part of the Aberfan story that is hardest to bear, and it is the part this channel is most obligated to tell plainly. In the years before the disaster, there had been concern about the colliery tips above Aberfan. There had been instability in the tips before. Tip material had moved before, in earlier incidents on that hillside. The behavior of waste tips and the danger of building them on wet ground was not unknown to people in the mining industry and to people in the area. And there were warnings raised about these specific tips above this specific village. People connected with the village, including, the record shows, those concerned for the safety of the school, had raised the question of the tips, the danger of the tips, the fear that the tips above the village were not safe. The local authority had expressed concern. The danger of tipping waste on that hillside, above those houses and that school, had been put into words by worried people before the 21st of October 1966. The warnings existed. They were specific. They named the danger, and the disaster happened anyway. I want to be careful and exact about why the warnings failed, because the failure of those warnings is the deepest cause of the disaster, and understanding it matters more than condemning it. The warnings failed because there was no effective system to receive them and act on them. Think about what a warning needs in order to save lives. It needs to reach someone with the authority and the responsibility to act. It needs to be assessed by someone competent to judge it. And it needs to result in action, inspection, engineering assessment, and if necessary, the moving or the stabilizing of the danger. At Aberfan, that chain did not exist. The tips were not subject to a proper regime of inspection and engineering control. There was no clear, robust system by which a concern about tip safety, raised by a worried parent, by a local official, by anyone, would be channeled to a qualified engineer, assessed, and converted into action on the tip itself. The concern could be raised, it could be expressed and felt and written down, but there was no machinery to turn it into a saved life. In the Piper Alpha episode, I described workers whose safety concerns did not travel because they feared for their jobs. In the Boston molasses flood episode, I described a leaking tank whose distress signal had no regulatory machinery to answer it. Aberfan is the same failure, and it is the cruelest version of it. The mountain above the village was a known concern, and the concern died in the gap between being felt and being acted upon. There is a particular detail that the inquiry brought out, and it deserves to be stated because it captures the whole failure in a single fact. The tip that failed had been built over the springs. The water on that hillside was a known feature, and the inquiry found that the danger of tipping over water on that ground was something that should have been recognized and acted upon. The disaster did not require some subtle, hidden, unforeseeable cause. It required only that a mass of waste be built over springs, on a slope, above a village, without engineering oversight, and that this be allowed to continue despite the water being known and despite warnings being raised. The inquiry's conclusion on this point, when it came, was not gentle and it was not hedged. It found that the disaster was the result of a failure to act on a known danger, that it could have been and should have been prevented. This channel reconstructs disasters in order to find their lessons. The lesson of Aberfan begins here, in the years before the slide, with warnings that were spoken into a system that had no way to hear them. The 21st of October 1966 was a Friday. It was the last day of the school week before a holiday. It was a damp, misty autumn morning in the valley. The hillside soaked from the wet weeks before, the tip above the village heavy with water. In the village, the morning was beginning in the ordinary way. And in the village school, the primary school, at the foot of the slope, the children were arriving and gathering and beginning their day. I want to be plain and careful about the school because the school is the heart of this disaster. It was a primary school. It was full of young children and the staff who taught them. It sat at the foot of the hillside, downslope from the colliery tips. The children in it that morning were doing what children do on the last morning before a holiday, arriving, settling into their classrooms, the day getting underway. High on the slope above them, saturated, weakened past the threshold of its strength, the tip began to move. The tip failed high on the slope, and the saturated mass of waste began to descend. And because of the water within it, it did not descend as a slow, rumbling slump of rock. It descended as a flow. The mass of waste, saturated and weakened past the point of holding, moved down the hillside as a fast-moving, flowing slide. A great dark wave of liquefied colliery waste, slurry and rock and water pouring down the slope toward the village below. It moved fast. It moved with enormous force. It moved far faster than a person on the slope could have run from it. The flowing waste came down the hillside, and at the foot of the slope it reached the village. It reached houses, and it reached the school. The slide of waste struck the primary school and engulfed it. It overwhelmed the building, with the children and the staff inside it. A part of the village school and houses near it were buried by the moving mass of colliery waste. I am going to handle the aftermath of the slide with the greatest care because what happened at the school at Aberfan is one of the most painful events this channel has ever reconstructed. And the dignity of the children and their families requires restraint. 144 people were killed in the Aberfan disaster. Of those 144, 116 were children. The great majority of the children who died were pupils of the village primary school, killed when the slide engulfed it. The disaster also killed adults, members of the school staff, and people in the houses that were struck. I am not going to describe the deaths of the children in detail. The plain fact that a slide of industrial waste engulfed a primary school and killed 116 children is a fact that needs no elaboration to convey its horror. It is quite simply almost the worst thing this channel has ever had to report. A village in South Wales lost. In a few minutes, on a Friday morning, a substantial part of an entire generation of its children. What happened next, in the hours after the slide, was that the village, and then a great many others, began to dig. The response to the Aberfan disaster was, before it was anything else, a desperate effort to reach the children. The people of Aberfan itself, parents, neighbors, the men of the village, many of them miners, went to the school and began to dig into the waste with their hands and with whatever tools they had searching for the children. They were joined, as fast as people could reach the village, by the colliery's own miners, by emergency services, by rescue workers, by people who came from across the valleys and beyond. An enormous crowd of would-be rescuers converged on the buried school, and the digging was agonizing. The rescuers were working through a mass of colliery waste, searching for children, knowing that every minute mattered. There were children rescued alive from the school in the early part of the effort. But as the hours passed, the terrible reality settled over the work, that the slide had been too sudden and too complete, and that the digging, increasingly, was a recovery rather than a rescue. The men of Aberfan dug for their own children and for their neighbors' children in the waste that their own industry had placed on the hill above them. There is no harder image in the entire record of this channel. I want to mark the rescuers of Aberfan the way this channel marks the responders in every episode. But here the marking is different and harder. The men who dug at Aberfan were not mostly an emergency service arriving from outside to face a stranger's disaster. They were the village. They were the fathers of the children in the school. They were the miners of the colliery whose waste had come down the hill. They dug anyway. They dug through the night and beyond in the waste, searching, and many of them were searching for their own. The colliery's miners, skilled in working ground, brought their skill to the most terrible task it could ever be turned to. In the Piper Alpha episode, the responders were the crews of small boats at Texas City, a fire department. In the Boston molasses flood, a crowd wading into the flood. At Aberfan, the responders were a grieving village digging for its own children. This channel always says that the people who pay for a disaster are almost never the people who designed the procedures that caused it. Aberfan is the starkest proof of that sentence ever recorded. The waste was placed on the hill by an industry and an institution. The price was paid by the children of the village and by the parents who dug for them. The Aberfan disaster was investigated by a formal tribunal of inquiry established to determine what had happened and why. The tribunal was a serious, lengthy public proceeding. It heard from a great many witnesses. It examined the tips, the springs, the history of the tipping, the warnings that had been raised, the system or the absence of a system by which the tips had been managed. And the tribunal's report, when it was delivered, did something that the reports following disasters do not always do. It spoke plainly. It did not hide its conclusions in cautious, technical, evasive language. It stated, in clear and forceful terms, what it had found. And what it had found was that the Aberfan disaster could have been, and should have been, prevented. The tribunal did not find that Aberfan was a tragic accident in the sense of an unforeseeable misfortune. It found the opposite. It found a disaster that flowed from negligence, from a failure to manage the tip safely, a failure to heed clear warnings, a failure that had as its consequence the deaths of 116 children. I want to be careful about how I convey the tribunal's findings because they were strong. And a disaster forensics channel must convey strong findings accurately and without embellishment. The tribunal found that the disaster was caused by the tipping of colliery waste on a hillside in a way that was unsafe. In particular, the building of a tip over the springs, on ground where water was present. It found that the danger had not been recognized and managed as it should have been. It found that there had been a failure of the responsible parties to devise and apply a proper system for the safe management of the tips. And it found that warnings had been given, that the instability of tips and concern about these tips above this village had been raised, and that those warnings had not been acted upon as they should have been. The tribunal's report directed responsibility for the disaster in clear terms at the failures of the body responsible for the colliery and its tips, and at the individuals whose responsibility the safe management of the tips had been. It was, by the standards of such reports, an unusually direct and unsparing document. It refused to soften the finding that 144 people, most of them children, had died because of preventable failures. The tribunal's plainness was, in its way, a kind of respect. It refused to let the deaths of the children be blurred into a misfortune. It insisted in the official record that this had been a failure, and that failures have causes, and causes have responsibility. Let me lay out the causes of the Aberfan disaster, the way this channel always does, as a chain, link by link, because the chain is the lesson, and at Aberfan, the chain is also the indictment. The first link is the tipping itself. Colliery waste was tipped year after year into great mounds on a steep hillside directly above a village, above its houses and its school. The second link is the absence of engineering oversight. Those tips were large, potentially dangerous structures, but they were managed as mere dumping. There was no proper system for assessing their stability, no qualified engineering attention being paid to whether they were safe above the village. The third link is the springs. The tip that failed was built over known sources of water, over springs on the hillside, so that it was being saturated from below, the water steadily destroying the strength of the mass. The fourth link is the rain. The wet autumn of 1966 soaked the tip further from above, driving its water content and its instability toward the threshold of failure. And the fifth link, beneath all the others, is the failure of warning. The danger of the tips had been raised, concern had been expressed, specifically about the tips above Aberfan. But there was no effective system to receive those warnings, assess them, and convert them into action. And so the warnings died. And the tip remained, and the children remained in the school beneath it. This is the pattern Post-Mortem returns to in every episode, and Aberfan states it with a clarity that is almost unbearable. A catastrophic disaster is almost never one mistake, and almost never one villain. It is a long line of holes. Holes in the practice of tipping, holes in the engineering oversight, holes in the understanding of the ground, holes in the response to weather, holes in the system for hearing warnings. Most of the time, a tip stands. Most wet autumns pass without a slide. The tips above Aberfan had stood for years, but the holes had been lining up for those years. The tip built over the springs, the absence of oversight, the warnings unheard, and on the wet morning of the 21st of October 1966, the last hole opened, and the path ran clear, all the way from a mound of colliery waste to a buried school. And I want to name the deepest hole plainly, because the tribunal did. It was not the rain. Rain was foreseeable. It was not even, in the end, the springs alone. It was the failure to treat a mountain of waste above a village as the deadly serious thing it was. And the failure to build any system that would let a frightened community's warning reach a person with the power and the duty to act. The Aberfan disaster did not leave the management of industrial waste unchanged. No disaster of this magnitude ever does. And Aberfan, with its 116 dead children, forced change of a fundamental kind. The most direct change concerned the tips themselves. After Aberfan, the safe management of colliery spoil tips and of similar accumulations of industrial waste was placed under a proper regime. The disaster led to legislation specifically addressing the safety of mine and quarry tips. The principle that was established was the principle that had been missing at Aberfan. A large tip is an engineering structure, and its stability is an engineering responsibility. After the disaster, tips came to be subject to proper inspection, to engineering assessment of their stability, to oversight by people qualified to judge whether a mountain of waste was safe. The unexamined dumping of waste above communities, the practice that had built the mountain over Aberfan, was brought under control. The tips that existed above other mining communities were assessed and, where necessary, made safe or removed. The specific danger that had killed the children of Aberfan, an unengineered mass of waste, looming and unwatched over a village, was, by deliberate effort, addressed. But the deepest legacy of Aberfan, I think, is not the specific legislation about tips. It is a broader and harder lesson, and it is the lesson this channel has reached from many directions, again and again. Aberfan was, above all, a failure to listen. The danger was known. The warnings were given, and there was no system to hear them. The lasting lesson of Aberfan is that a hazard near a community is not safely managed simply because no one in authority has chosen to worry about it. It is safely managed only when there exists a real, robust, funded system of inspection, of inspection, of engineering oversight, of accountability that actively looks for the danger. And that can receive a warning from anyone, from a parent, from a local official, from a worker, and convert that warning into action. In the Piper Alpha episode, the lesson was that resilient safety does not depend on a verbal conversation happening at a busy shift change. In the Boston Molasses Flood episode, the lesson was that a structure's distress signal needs machinery to answer it. Aberfan is the same lesson, written in the deaths of children. A warning is not a safety system. The safety system is the machinery that makes a warning matter. Aberfan had the warning, it did not have the machinery, and 116 children died in the gap between the two. I have to address one more part of the aftermath because it belongs in an honest reconstruction, and because it is one of the elements of Aberfan that has troubled people most deeply in the decades since. After the disaster, a fund was established to receive the enormous public response, money given from across the country and beyond by people moved by the deaths of the children, intended for the bereaved village. And the handling of that fund and of certain costs associated with the disaster and its aftermath, including the question of the remaining tips and who should bear the cost of removing them, became, in the years that followed, a source of real and lasting grievance for the people of Aberfan. The community's sense was that, having lost its children to an institution's failure, it was then not treated, in the aftermath, with the fairness and the generosity that failure demanded. I am not going to detail every twist of that long aftermath, but I will say the thing about it that belongs on this channel. As in the Bhopal episode and the Texas City episode, the forensic question. What failed, and why proved easier to answer than the question of justice? The tribunal could state the cause plainly. Whether the people of Aberfan were treated justly in the years that followed is a separate question. And the honest answer, by the community's own long testimony, is that for a great while they were not. I want to spend a scene near the end on what makes the Aberfan disaster different from every other disaster this channel has reconstructed, and on why it occupies the place it does in the memory of a nation. This channel has reconstructed disasters with far higher death tolls than Aberfan's 144. Bhopal killed thousands. Tenerife killed 583. But Aberfan has a particular and terrible character that sets it apart, and it is this. The dead of Aberfan were overwhelmingly children. 116 children. Most of them pupils of a single primary school in a single small village. A village is not an abstraction. A village school is not an abstraction. The children who died at Aberfan were a substantial part of an entire age group of one community. The children who would have grown up together, who would have been the village's next generation. The disaster did not strike a population at random. It struck, with appalling concentration, the children of one place. Aberfan is remembered with a special and permanent grief in Wales and far beyond it because of that. It is remembered as the disaster that buried a school. It is remembered as the morning a village lost its children. I want to be careful here, with the purpose of this channel, because Aberfan tests it. Post-Mortem reconstructs disasters in order to find their causes and their lessons. We do that work in a measured voice with restraint. Because the restraint is a form of respect, and because the lesson is best served by clarity rather than by drama. But the reconstruction of Aberfan must not, in its measured voice, ever lose hold of what was actually lost: the chain of causes, the tipping, the absent oversight, the springs, the rain, the unheard warnings. That chain is real, and it is the lesson. And this episode has laid it out as plainly as it can. And at the same time, the thing the chain produced was 116 dead children in a Welsh village, and the grief of the parents who survived them, and a community that has carried that mourning for the rest of its life. Both of those things are true at once: the forensic chain and the unbearable loss. This channel holds them together, because that is the honest thing to do. Aberfan was a solvable engineering and institutional failure, and Aberfan was the worst grief a community can know. To tell it properly is to refuse to let either of those truths hide the other. In Aberfan, the disaster is remembered, and it is remembered with care. There is a memorial garden on the site where the village school once stood, a quiet, tended place of remembrance for the children and the adults who died on the 21st of October, 1966. There is a memorial in the village cemetery where many of the children are buried together. The village kept faith with its dead, and it has carried their memory with dignity through all the decades since, and the disaster is remembered far beyond the village. Aberfan entered the conscience of a nation. The name of that village became and remains a byword for the deaths of children, for the cost of negligence, and for the absolute duty of those who place a hazard near a community to keep that community safe. That is the truth that Post-Mortem keeps returning to, and it is the truth I want to leave you with tonight. A colliery, like a chemical plant, like a reactor, like a bridge, is the source of something a community is told it needs, and it is also a promise. It is a promise made to every person who lives in the valley below it, that the people who run it understand the danger they have created and have done everything that can be done to keep it from them. At Aberfan, that promise failed completely. A mountain of waste was built year after year on a steep hillside above a village, over known springs, without engineering oversight against clear and specific warnings. The promise was hollow for years before the slide. And on a wet October morning, the hollow promise came down the hill and engulfed a school. None of the change that came afterward, the proper regulation of tips, the engineering oversight, the principle that a mass of waste above a community is a serious and watched responsibility. None of it happened because the industry, left alone, decided to do better. It happened because 116 children died beneath a mountain of waste in a Welsh village, and a nation could not and would not look away from the size of it. The children of Aberfan are remembered in the garden on the hillside and in the cemetery of the village. If reconstructions like this matter to you, carry their names a little further by remembering why they died. Thank you for sitting with this one. If reconstructions like this matter to you, subscribe. The channel is here for them.